Continuing with Chapter 7, I'd like to talk about the different kinds of memory. Explicit memory is that long-term storage for conscious memories that you can describe verbally, for events that have occurred that you can remember and talk about. We can distinguish between episodic and semantic memories in that episodic memories are episodes, they're events that we can talk about, and semantic memory is information that's not tied to a particular event. It's general knowledge about the world. Distinct from explicit memories are implicit memories. These are the unconscious, non-verbal memories, things that you can't talk about, but things you can do. For example, in this slide, the individual is engaged in mirror drawing, where they have to trace a figure by looking at its reflection in the mirror. This is a skill that can increase with practice, and that's what we mean by implicit memories. Another type of implicit memory, besides these procedures, these skills, is classical conditioning. We talked in Chapter 6 about classically conditioned phobias, say, and these are unconscious reactions that occur without you being able to describe exactly what's going on. Now, up to now, I've been talking about retrospective memory, things that happened in the past. But there's another kind of memory that's much more difficult called prospective memory. That's remembering to do something in the future. This is much more difficult because there's no memory encoded to retrieve. So one thing you can do to kind of help with this is to create one, in essence. If you have to accomplish a particular task at a particular time and place, think about something that can serve as a cue when you're there, and use that to form a classically conditioned response where you remember to do the task at that time. We use different parts of the brain to perform different types of tasks, and memory is no exception. For example, the prefrontal cortex is necessary for working memory, the temporal lobe for explicit memories, both for encoding and retrieving, the amygdala for emotional memories, the cerebellum for implicit, in particular, procedural memories, and the hippocampus for not only encoding memories, but for consolidation of spatial information. Consolidation is that process by which information gets stored in long-term memory. Now, this is a physical change in the anatomy of the brain. Short-term memory is just strengthening synapses that are already there. Long-term memory is actually the growth of new synapses, new connections. Once we store information in memory, we have to get it out periodically and use it, and then we store it again. When we do that, this is called reconsolidation. Now, the process of retrieving and then restoring information actually changes the memory. Whenever we recall something, there may be slight details that are different, and during the recall, there may be events that occur that change the memory for us. And so when we restore it, what we've stored again is a changed memory, and that's what we recall the next time. So there's kind of a process of encoding, storage, retrieval. Something happens, changes the memory. We encode that, we store it, we retrieve it, and then we repeat the process over and over. So how do we get information that we stored in memory? There are a number of different cues we can use to retrieve information that's been stored in long-term memory, including context and physiological state. But we do forget things, and we do distort memories, and sometimes we can't forget stuff that we'd like to, which is the opposite problem. A retrieval cue is anything that helps you access the information that's in long-term storage. So, for example, the context, what's around you, cues in the environment. These serve as classically conditioned cues to allow you to retrieve the information more easily. State-dependent cues are internal physical cues that also serve as classically conditioned stimuli that help us to retrieve information that we've stored in long-term memory. An example of context is this fascinating study in which people learned a list of words, and they learned them in one of two conditions, either on land or underwater. And then they recalled them in one of two conditions, either on land or underwater. So there are four groups here. A group that learned the information on land and repeated it on land, a group that learned the information on land and retrieved it underwater, a group that learned the information underwater and retrieved it on land, and a group that learned the information on land and retrieved it underwater. Now, how could they retrieve information and learn information underwater? Well, scuba divers have these fascinating whiteboards that they can write on underwater, so they were able to use those to keep the learning situation the same in both contexts. And what's fascinating is that being underwater didn't really impair memory. What impaired memory was retrieving the information in a different setting, either on land or underwater, from which they had learned the information. So the context, the cues around them, the land or the water, allowed them to be more accurate in retrieving the information. Mnemonics are another way that people can use retrieval cues. And these are ancient techniques. The method of loci goes back thousands of years to the ancient Greeks. And in this method, people memorize a visual scene, such as a room in your house, and then they visualize each item they're trying to remember at a particular place in that room. And when they're trying to remember the information, they simply visualize the item on that piece of furniture or other location in the room. In one of the classic experiments, the psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus memorized lists of nonsense syllables. These were composed of a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant. So they're three-letter nonsense syllables. He memorized each list, and then once he had it down, he went back the next day and memorized it again. And what he found was that the number of times he had practiced it on the first day corresponded to a faster time, that is, fewer errors, learning it on the second day. So you can see from the graph that as the number of repetitions, the number of times he practiced the list on day one increased, the time it took him to relearn the list on the second day would be less and less each time. Sometimes information that we're learning at different times can interfere with what we're trying to remember. Now, there are two kinds of interference. There's retroactive interference and there's proactive interference. Retroactive interference occurs when older memories are hard to access because you have new information. That is, the interference goes backwards. You've learned something, you learn a second set of information, and then you try to remember the first set of information, and you have a hard time because that second set interferes with the first set. So, for example, you have a phone number, you get a new phone number. Now, later on, you're trying to remember the first phone number for some form that you're filling out, and you have a hard time because the new phone number is interfering with your ability to remember the old one. Proactive interference is when older information interferes forward. It interferes with your ability to learn some new information. So, for example, you have a spouse or a significant other. You break up with them and you get a new one, and then you call your new partner by the old partner's name. The old information is interfered with remembering the new partner's name. So proactive interference can be a real problem. A lot of times we forget things where we could just almost remember it, and we have that kind of tip of the tongue phenomenon. If you've ever just almost been able to remember something, and then you just feel like it's just right there, but you can't get it. That's the tip of the tongue. And that's when there's something that's similar to that that's interfering, it's blocking your ability to remember it. Absent-mindedness is when we're not fully concentrating on information, so it doesn't get encoded well. And without encoding, of course, you can't retrieve it. On the other hand, some memories we'd like to get rid of, particularly traumatic memories. And when these things persist, particularly when it's memories of an unpleasant event, sometimes this can produce PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. There's some really interesting work going on now to help people to use reconsolidation to change those memories and reduce the amount of trauma that they remember. We like to think of our memory as completely accurate. But the problem is, it really isn't. And there are a number of ways that memory gets distorted. When, as I mentioned before, when we recall something, we change it often in some ways. Whether somebody suggests something to us, whether we just remember the details wrong, in any case, we can actually change the memory. Memory bias is the tendency that we have to have our memories for events change over time to fit our current beliefs or attitudes or the way we see the world. So we may remember our actions in a more positive or admirable light now based on the kinds of ways that we see ourselves in the current time that may not have been how we see ourselves in the past. or our values may have changed. The classic example of this is the person who catches the fish, and the fish gets larger with each retelling of the story. Flashbulb memories are those memories for incredibly significant events that everybody remembers happening. Whether it's the Twin Tower 9/11, or it's the Boston bombing, it's the Challenger explosion, in earlier generations, the Kennedy assassination, or Pearl Harbor. And the term comes from the fact that newspapers used to rarely print pictures because it was very difficult and expensive. And the pictures that they took involved these giant box cameras, and they literally had a flash that burned to provide the lighting for the picture. So they would take a flash picture of only really significant events. We are much more confident in our flashbulb memories. We think, I will never forget where I am, where I was when such and such occurred. And these memories tend to persist. The problem is that the details of these memories are no more accurate than the details for other kinds of memories. When the Challenger exploded in January of 1986, two psychologists had 44 psychology students fill out a questionnaire the day of the shuttle explosion. When they tested the students' memories 3 years later, only 3 students had perfect recall. The rest were incorrect about multiple aspects of the situation. And in the control group, the accuracy was about the same. So while we're very sure about those memories and we have strong reactions to them, they are no more accurate than any other memories. Even though people tend to be much more confident about their flashbulb memories than they are about other kinds of memories. One of the distortions of memory is misattribution, or sometimes called source misattribution. We remember lots of facts. Our brains are full of all these things. But sometimes it's difficult to remember where we heard that, where we learned that. You say, man, I heard about such and such. And somebody asks, well, where'd you hear that? And you're like, I'm not really sure. Other times, and this is particularly unfortunate or problematic for students, we have something called cryptomnesia, where we have an idea and it seems original to us. It seems like we came up with this. But in fact, we got it from someone else. And we don't know this. And so you end up with inadvertent plagiarism, which is why it's always good to check your papers through a plagiarism checker before turning them in. There was a novel in 2006 called How Opal Meta Got Kissed, Got Wild, and Got a Life. The author was a student at Harvard who, it turns out, some of the passages in the book were actually from other books that she had read in high school. And this resulted in the book having to be pulled from shelves, and it was a real mess. We're also fairly suggestible. It's easy to get people to remember things that didn't happen or to change the details of events. We had a small demonstration of this in class last time with a list of words around the topic of sleep. What you see here are pictures from an experiment conducted in the 1970s by Elizabeth Loftus. People viewed a videotape of this red car approaching a stop sign. A second group viewed a videotape of the same scene, but with a yield sign. Each group was then asked, did another car pass the red Datsun when it was stopped at the stop sign? So they both were asked about a stop sign, even though only one group saw the stop sign. Some participants in the second group claimed to have seen the red Datsun stop at a stop sign, even though it actually was just approaching a yield sign and never stopped. In another experiment, she showed participants a videotape of a car accident. They were then asked questions about the car accident, and the questions were all the same in each group, except one group was asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, and another group was asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. The people who heard the word smashed estimated a faster speed, and that's not surprising. What is surprising is a week later, each group was asked, did they see broken glass on the ground? There is no broken glass in the video, but nearly a third of those who heard the word smashed recalled seeing broken glass from the headlights. Nobody from the group that heard the word hit remembered this. So just by changing one word in the question, they were able to create a false memory in a third of people. These two men are linked because the man on the top spent 5 years in prison for robbery that the man on the bottom committed. There were 2 eyewitnesses who identified the man on the top, even though he actually was not the one who did it. So memories, our eyewitness memories for viewings of strangers can be very inaccurate. And there are numerous cases where people have been convicted, sent to prison, and then later exonerated by DNA evidence or other evidence that showed that they couldn't possibly have done this. Of the first 100 people in the U.S. who were exonerated by DNA evidence, 2/3 of them had been identified by eyewitnesses as the perpetrator. Okay, thank you. I will see you all on Thursday. Take care.